The Saab 17 was the first all-metal aircraft developed in Sweden. It was also to be the first aircraft built by Saab, who had only been formed on the 2nd of April 1937. But before we talk about this aircraft, it's worth taking a brief look at the general and very confusing state of the Swedish aviation industry at this time, as it directly relates to the development of this particular aircraft. Throughout 1936 and 1937, questions and answers were being put forward on how to form a modern Swedish aircraft industry. In early 1937, representatives for some of the leading companies which had expressed an interest in building up an aircraft industry were summoned to a meeting with the Prime Minister. These men represented the arms manufacturers Nohab and Bofors, the Götaverken shipyard, already an aircraft manufacturer, and ASJA. Unwilling to disclose any preferences or appearances of favoritism, it was decided that the best solution would be the formation of a new company. However, this too was also fraught with difficult choices. Before a final decision could be made, a third solution was presented. Nohab and ASJA joined forces early in February and presented government with a joint alternative. The idea was that Nohab would form a subsidiary, Saab, and then Saab and ASJA together would then form a new joint venture called the United Aircraft Works, which would be known as AFF. AFF would be responsible for development and deliveries, while construction and manufacturing was to be split between the two companies. There's a lot more to it than this very brief summary, and there's a couple of other companies and subsidiaries involved as well, but I did only want to cover this briefly to explain the relationship between Saab and ASJA specifically, and keep the video more focused on the aircraft. Speaking of which, in 1938 the Swedish Air Force was looking for a new reconnaissance aircraft. And with storm clouds gathering over Europe, there was a growing need to modernise the Swedish military assets. Two designs would be submitted, one by AFF and the other by ASJA directly. ASJA had not been comfortable with the design submitted by the AFF Design Office, and had made a parallel design of their own. This also included a response to the new requirement that the aircraft could be built as a light bomber without an excessive amount of redesign. To improve their development work, ASJA had augmented its engineering staff by hiring 48 American designers and specialists between 1938 and 1939. However, their stay in Sweden would be short-lived, as they were called back to the US at the outbreak of war in Europe. Nevertheless, their input was valuable and significantly aided the design process. In August, AFF submitted the two designs, and was awarded a contract to develop and build two prototypes of the ASJA design, which at the time was known as the L-10, and the prototype would be given the designation P-7. The sudden departure of the American designers and engineers in 1939 and 1940 caused development delays, as ASJA and Saab moved to fill the gaps, often with inexperienced personnel. However, the prototypes were completed by the spring, and the first aircraft, now known as the Saab 17, took to the sky for the first time on the 18th of May 1940. The two aircraft were almost identical, except for a difference in engines. The first prototype was powered by a Swedish-built Nohab Bristol Mercury 12 of 800 horsepower, and the second aircraft would be powered by a Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp, which produced 1,065 horsepower. The aircraft was designed as a mid-wing all-metal cantilever monoplane. It boasted several advanced design features, including flush riveting to reduce drag. It also housed a roomy, high-visibility canopy for a crew of two, a pilot, and an observer who also acted as a navigator and rear gunner. For maximum strength, the central fuselage was designed without any cutouts for the undercarriage. The landing gear and the tailwheel were still fully retractable, but instead of being housed within the fuselage or the wing, it instead retracted against the wing and was protected by a streamlined metal covering that was fixed to the gear itself. This covering was dual purpose, as not only did it protect the gear from the elements, but it also acted as an air brake during a dive bombing attack. The Saab 17 was also designed to have the landing gear replaced with floats for landing on large bodies of water, and, Sweden being Sweden, home to moose and snow, the aircraft could also be equipped with retractable landing skis. The aircraft's armament consisted of two 8mm machine guns mounted in the wings, and one 8mm machine gun on a flexible mount at the rear seat. In terms of payload, it could carry up to 700 kilograms of bombs. Racks were provided under the wings, and the fuselage had an internal bomb bay that could accommodate one 250 kilo bomb or 8 50 kilo bombs. Earlier versions of the aircraft were also equipped with a special mechanism that lowered an externally carried 500 kilo bomb free of the propeller arc. Though innovative, this feature would not last, as the advent of the Saab BT-2 bomb sight would soon make dive bombing obsolete. In fact, dive bombing would be rapidly discouraged when the first production models arrived, as it was discovered that their wings had a nasty habit of falling off during a dive. The wings were of course promptly strengthened, but the aircraft were only ever cleared for shallow dive bombing during their service life. In the autumn of 1940, Saab was awarded contracts for 174 aircraft, all of them being the reconnaissance version that was to be dubbed the S-17. A year later, that order was increased to 262 units, of which one batch was to be built as light bombers designated as the B-17. This batch was then increased again to become the major part of the order by the end of the following year. Developing the prototype had been a complicated endeavour, but completing the production versions quickly made that feel like a spring picnic. First of all, production was complicated by the problems of engine availability. Initially, the aircraft was planned for the Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp. This version was designated the B-17A in the Swedish Air Force. The Twin Wasp engine, however, did not become available in suitable numbers until 1943-1944, and therefore the first version of the aircraft to go into production was the B-17B, powered by a Swedish-built Bristol Mercury 24 engine. But there's more. In 1941, the Air Force was able to produce some Italian engines which produced 1,040 horsepower, and this was then used to power the B-17C. The Twin Wasp-powered B-17A thus became the last version to go into production, despite being the first designed. All in all, the first production aircraft would fly on the 1st of December 1941, and the last delivery took place in autumn of 1944. Shortly after this, the wings started falling off during the service trials for dive bombing, and production had to be halted whilst they were strengthening and redesigning the wings. In terms of dimensions and performance, I'll quote the figures for the B-17A to keep things simple. It had a length of 9.8 meters, a wingspan of 13.7 meters, and a height of 4 meters. It had a relatively light empty weight of 2,600 kilograms and a loaded weight of 3,970 kilograms. It had a maximum speed of 435 km an hour, a cruising speed of 390 km an hour, and a range of 1,800 km. From 1942, the Saab 17 would be fielded by 6 light bomber and reconnaissance wings of the Swedish Air Force, but due to Sweden's neutrality, they would not see any combat during World War II. In the final phase of the war, it was feared that German troops in Denmark and Norway would not obey Germany's order for total surrender. In Sweden, the Danish Brigade, first organised in 1943, had been trained to use the B-17 and were put on alert for deployment, but the order to fly never came from Denmark. Due to the rapid advances in aviation technology, the aircraft were retired from frontline service in 1948. However, they would get a second lease of life with the Ethiopian Air Force. Between 1947 and 1953, the Ethiopian Air Force, which had been organised by Swedish officers at the request of Emperor Haile Selassie, eventually purchased a total of 47 Saab 17As in 3 batches. The aircraft proved to be ideal for the rugged conditions in Ethiopia. In the late 1950s, a number of Fairey Firefly aircraft were acquired from Canada in order to modernise the Air Force. But these aircraft finished their service in Ethiopia well before the Saab 17s, which were still in operation in squadrons in the 1960s. Even in the 1970s, a few aircraft were still operating with Ethiopia after more than 25 years of service. Starting in 1951, the Air Board released a number of Saab 17As to serve as civil registered target towing aircraft for the Swedish Armed Forces. The aircraft were still owned by the Air Board but were operated by private companies. Eventually, a total of 20 Saab 17s were on the Swedish Civil Register. 2 Saab 17 seaplanes were also in civil use between 1949 and 1951. One target towing plane was sold to Austria in 1957, and 2 years later, 2 more similar aircraft were also sold to the Finnish Air Force. Several models survive to this day, including a pair that are kept at the Swedish Air Force Museum, with one of them still being in an airworthy condition.